Welcome to your year 2021 Zodiac forecast. I'm astrologer Patrick Arundell. Thank you so much for joining me. I'd be honoured if you'd subscribe to my channel. Now I'm going to provide a penetrative insight for each of the 12 zodiac signs, so please stay with me for that. But just to say, if you'd like to ascend beyond your zodiac sign, which is just based on the location of the sun and how the planets interact with that, and find out what this new year will hold for you as an individual, there is nothing more accurate and telling than a personal forecast. Now you can get your 12-month personal forecast for 2021 plus a character analysis for 30% off, a special offer. Please see the link below. But also know, if you order in 2020, I'll give you the rest of 2020 free. So if you order in October, you get October, November, December, plus the following 12 months. Now your zodiac forecast is going to be of great interest to you, of course, and it does give us a fascinating insight into what we can expect. But of course, the zodiac or the horoscope contains much more information than just our sun. And that's where that personal horoscope comes in. But also, as we start each year, we have a solar return. And I want you to think of that solar return at midnight on the 1st of January 2021 as like your personal birth chart. It gives us a blueprint of what we can all expect collectively for this new year. So I'm going to share that information next. But when I go into your zodiac forecast, I'll be sharing different wheels, the different eclipses, to give you a really big opportunity to get a feel for what's coming for you. But astrology is basically the study of time. And when events happen in the past, when particular planetary alignments occur, when we look forwards to see when those alignments will happen again, it gives us a bit of a clue of what we can expect. And the fascinating thing, of course, is that as 2020 came to a close on the December, Saturn moved back into Aquarius. It had been there from the 22nd of March to the 2nd of August 2020, but it moves from the cold sign of Capricorn, which it governs in its dignity. It's the sole ruler of Capricorn, and it moved into the sign of Aquarius, where it's the co-regent along with Uranus. Now it was joined on the 20th of December by Jupiter. And then on the 21st of December, they came into a conjunction. And that conjunction is still there. It's not quite exact, but it's still there as we begin this new year. Now, what we can learn from those past events is that the last time this happened was in fact in 1405. So a very, very long time ago, and that was on the 7th of January. And I think what began at that time was the Cultural Revolution in a way. So what we can expect this year is a revolution, that's for sure. And of course we were seeing elements of that revolution beginning last year. And part of the revolution can be evolution. It doesn't always have to be turbulent, but there are certain parts of what happened in 2020 that were, of course, very turbulent. Now, the conjunction that goes between the planets of Jupiter, which is about expansion and growth and optimism, and Saturn, which is about resistance, obstacles, boundaries, tradition, usually happens just under every 20 years, about 19.8 years. This is because Jupiter takes 11.8 years to go through its cycle, and Saturn takes 29.5 years to complete its cycle. And over the last 1,000 years, predominantly, the three signs that this conjunction has occurred in most of all are of Sagittarius, Capricorn, and Pisces. So that's what makes this Aquarius conjunction so absolutely blindingly exciting. Now, it's also true to say that the eclipse cycle that we welcomed in on the 14th of December 2020 was the Saros cycle that is featuring the polar axes of Sagittarius and Gemini. Now, that began on the 30th of May 1984 in the sign of Gemini with a solar eclipse. And if we look back to when eclipse cycles begin, that gives us a big idea of what they may bring in their wake. So that one had Saturn and Mars conjunct in the sign of Scorpio, very much to do with finance, but also to do with desire, could even say lust. But Saturn, of course, is about discipline, it's about those structures, and Mars, certainly in its second home zone of Scorpio, is very much about desire. So you can see that a certain amount of repression would come from that particular conjunction, but also the potential to work very hard on resources. And I think in terms of the material world, there's been a lot of development since 1984, and some people would argue a lot of growth. But on the other side of the heavens, where the eclipse occurred, not only did we have the solar eclipse in the wonderful, quick-witted Gemini, we also had Venus there, which is very flirty and alluring and attractive. But we also had Chiron, and that is the wounded healer, and that was conjunct the North Node and Venus. So for me, this pattern that we're beginning this year, or picking up the thread of, which has been rejuvenated by the solar eclipse in Sagittarius on the 14th of December, which forged an amazingly positive angle to Mars. So I think we're all going to be feeling a lot more hopeful as we come to the end of this year, because last year, 2020, was just so terribly trying. I think we are going to have a much greater sense of momentum, a much greater sense that something is shifting and moving in our consciousness, our way of being. But I think that gathering of energy back in 1984 in Gemini was really a lot to do with the way society has changed since then, not just in a material sense, but also in a social sense. So we've seen a mass transformation in the way we consume information, the media, which has come through the internet, and of course printed media has declined quite sharply, but they're very much governed by the sign of Gemini. So we could say that Chiron, the wounded healer, being in that part of the situation in conjunction with Venus, points towards a wound in what we believe in. And I think with that energy all clustered together based on universal central time in the 8th house of transformation, very Scorpionic itself, and Mars and Saturn in conjunction in Scorpio, we have had a lot of lust since 1984, and we have had a lot of challenges to ideas, because if we go back to that time, I think there was much more of an orthodox that most people were expected to fit into. People have found their voices, they expect to have their voice. Now on the other side of the heavens, with the solar eclipse that occurred on the 14th of December 2020, Sagittarius energy is about the higher principle of communication. So it's about philosophy, it's about the intellect, it's about history, travel, it's about borders. It can be about laws and regulations, but it's very much to do with trying to find the higher principles of society. And because it forged an amazing link with Mars, I think both being fire signs, after the really pulverizing difficulties of 2020, which saw the end of an eclipse cycle between the axes of Cancer, which is ruled by the moon, so that's very much to do with emotion, the family, security, the seas, the waters, if you like, and on the other side, the harsh, cold reality of business, big industries, and materialism in perhaps its most extreme form, which has battled with the need to find emotional security on the other side of the heavens in Cancer. So we've had this big battle going on over the last couple of years, which has really been very difficult. And I feel that obviously there are some institutions, some business strands, some countries which will try to withhold or to hold on to power in a very oppressive way. And on the other side of the heavens, we had the moon is the repressed emotions that have been held down for a long time, especially to do with civil rights and people speaking up much more ardently about what they want. So the Sagittarius energy that is coming along, which re-evokes that first 1984 eclipse in Gemini, when this Saros eclipse cycle began, is very much about communication and information. So this year we're going to see a lot of sharing of ideas, that's for sure. And of course, we're seeing a lot of polarization in people's viewpoints and a lot of outspoken expression of ideas, and sometimes not enough tolerance. So that's an interesting principle. So as we come into this new year, although Saturn is the co-ruler of Aquarius, and of course it was co-present with Jupiter over the last year as Jupiter made its way through the sign of Capricorn, where of course it's not at its best, it's in its fall, and we've had a fall in the stock market. And also if we look back to when Jupiter and Pluto were last together, that was in 2008 in Capricorn, we had a fall in the stock market. If we go back to that eclipse cycle beginning in 1984, guess where Jupiter was? Yes, in Capricorn. And guess what happened that year? Yes, we had a fall in the stock market. It wasn't perhaps as quite as catastrophic as 2008 or perhaps even 2020. And that might be because when Saturn and Mars are together, particularly in the sign of Scorpio, which is very much about marshalling investments and pensions and all the rest of it, I think that Saturn was probably a stabilising influence, and all that Gemini stuff was in the 8th house of business anyway. But the Dow Jones did shrink 4% in 1984, so we can see as Jupiter makes its way through Capricorn every 12 years or so, it's not for the best when it comes for finance, investment, business generally. So as we come into this new year, Jupiter and Saturn are together and they are still co-present, and some astrologers would argue therefore that because Saturn is the co-ruler of Aquarius, the traditional ruler, that some of the more cool repressive energies of Capricorn will still be to the fore. And they could be right. But for me, I think it's more about detachment. So what we're going to get over the next 2.25 years as Saturn makes its way through the sign of Aquarius is the Aquarius energies of kindness, of fairness, of truth can be melded to the more reserved nature of Saturn. So, for example, home working is very Aquarius, which has come about more because of COVID-19. It's very Aquarius, very independent. It's using technology, which Aquarius also welcomes for its modern ruler of Uranus. But in actual fact, I think it's going to lead to a lot of creeping isolation. I think people could kind of start to see that the world could become a kind of dystopianly detached place, which is not necessarily quite the utopia that people talk about for the Aquarian age. But that's where Jupiter can be a modifying influence for the cooler energies of Saturn. And I think the two together, as we turn into this new year, are going to be for the good. So this year is going to see Sagittarius and Gemini eclipse energy, apart from one lunar eclipse which will occur in the sign of Taurus. But what's really important is that Neptune, the planet of dreams, is going to be impacting all of these eclipses and also the North Node as we go through the whole of this year. The North Node is the kind of emotional direction of travel or society. It's in Gemini. It returns to 1 degree Gemini by the end of the year. But of course it's an air sign, just like Saturn and Jupiter begin the year in. So that airiness can be there, but that watery, eroding energy of Neptune can provide distortion. And I think the thing that's really going to be at stake this year, just as much as it has been in recent years, is the whole concept of the truth. You know, when we've got big media platforms saying it's not their role to govern the truthfulness or accuracy of what people say because everyone is entitled to an opinion, we're heading into really dark territory in my viewpoint. Traditional media, even if you're not a fan, has to live to certain parameters that come from regulation, even if sometimes they have stepped outside of it, probably quite often. But there is some regulation in place, whereas a lot of new media doesn't have any regulation, and that means that truth or facts get distorted to suit particular people's agendas. And I think we are going to still continue to have a lot of that in 2021. Now, the other thing that perhaps is not quite so well known is that although Jupiter will like being in Aquarius, and it is going to be much more expansive than it has been in the sign of Capricorn, it's not going to stay in Aquarius for the whole of this year. It's going to move mid-May into the sign of Pisces, and it's going to be there through to the 27th of July. Now, Jupiter, in fact, is the ruling planet or the co-ruler of Pisces, so it's returning home, and so that's an interesting one, but it does start to go into retrograde from the 20th of June for 4 months. So I think we might see a revival initially in the cruise industry by the middle of May. We might see bookings starting over again if COVID is coming back under a bit more control, as I believe it will. But I feel that once that retrograde begins, it is going to be very interesting how that affects the cruise industry. And the other thing I need to tell you is that in astrology, when we take a particular point like that solar return at the start of the year, we get a map just like your personal horoscope. And that solar return, I've created it based on universal central time. And the ascendant is actually in Libra, which is very much about finding balance. But the midpoint between the sun and the moon's in the sign of Leo as we begin this new year, and the sun will be in Capricorn as usual. So the midpoint between the two is 21 degrees in Libra. So this is going to be very much a Libran year. And 21 degrees Libra is quite a fascinating point, because it is going to be next to, or very close to, a fixed star which has the characteristic of both Saturn and Jupiter. And that fixed star is called Foramen. And Foramen is very much to do with journeys, particularly sea journeys. It's said to be broadly optimistic, but it can see passages from quite tumultuous events to much more enlightened understanding. And that seems to be where the world is at the moment. We have an opportunity to change how things are, but just finding a vaccine for COVID is not the answer. Many of us won't take it. And of course, many of us don't want to be ruled by fear, so we're going to carry on our lives. So it's an interesting fixed star to have on that midpoint, but also the midpoint is ruled in terms of the 12th harmonic, or the Dward, by the sign of Gemini. So, I'm talking about this Saros Eclipse series being very much to do with the polarities of Gemini and Sagittarius. Gemini, quick wits, communications, sharing of information, and the higher energy of Sagittarius. Now, like all zodiac signs, I'm not talking in terms of your zodiac sign or how you live within your zodiac sign, because we all have a choice to live to the best of our zodiac signs, or there is a more base instinct within each zodiac sign, and everybody has a choice. But this year predominantly is going to be about finding balance, it is going to be about communication, and it is going to be about trying to find a search for truth. Now, I mentioned before, what did I say for 2020? Well, the midpoint was actually in Aquarius, and it was conjunct Venus. And Venus in Aquarius is very much about us as a collective, and also is in the 4th house, which is about our sense of security. But we also had Neptune conjunct the moon as the solar return began for 2020. Quite incredible. So the Neptune in the sign of Pisces, which it governs, conjunct the moon. And Neptune is very much about gases, infections. It can be about uncontainable situations. It can be about distortion. It was also potentially very much about spirituality. It's about healing. But having that conjunct the moon for the world collective, where we all found out that wherever we lived in the world, we were all connected to the same issue like never before. That's quite extraordinary. And the other thing that all astrologers knew, of course, was that we had the posse in Capricorn of Saturn, Jupiter and Pluto. So most astrologers believed that there would be a crash in the stock market, so we weren't wrong about that. But the implications of this infection, COVID-19, very much was there in the stars. So this year, you can see that Neptune energies are still going to be very important, and that potential for distortion or dishonesty, perhaps from politicians particularly. It can be to do with how information is shared on social media platforms particularly, but it can also be to do with our imagination, or that we have choices about the way we want to live our lives. But Sagittarius generally is very much about travel, and I think the travel industry will get revived this year, but I think we're going to see changes. So we're going to see more temperature tests at airports and ports. We may see some very quick COVID tests being enacted, which will give very quick results, and we'll start to see more and more travel picking up. It's a fact, because people don't like to be contained. And Sagittarius energy is about adventurism. It's about being very independent. And last year was very much about being locked in, which was very uncomfortable for many of us, because above all else, Sagittarius energy is about individual freedom. So this year is a very, very exciting year. It does give us an opportunity to bounce back. It's not going to be without big challenges. We do have a very pressing right angle between Saturn and Uranus, the two rulers of Aquarius, which is going to go on to about the 31st of July. It comes back from around about the last 5 days of November to the end of the year. And that's a really difficult aspect, I feel, because Uranus, of course, is in the sign of Taurus, and that's very much to do with resisting change. Taurus likes continuity, whereas Uranus likes to shake things up. So our attitude to the earth, environmentalism, how we live, how we consume, which Taurus energy is very much about as well. It's what we enjoy eating, drinking, spending our money on, bit of luxury. All of us love a bit of luxury, but that's being tempered by this potential new world order that Jupiter and Saturn initially are bringing in the sign of Aquarius, plus that solar eclipse energy that really came in with such a hurtling ferocity in its wonderful trine with Mars on the 14th of December. We've had Venus moving mid-month December into the sign of Sagittarius. So it's a much freer, looser energy as we come into this new year. But stay with me now to get the inside track on your zodiac sign, because I really feel that this is a year that we need to be informed about like no other. Welcome, Aquarius, to your year 2021 Zodiac forecast. If you'd like to access your personal forecast based on your time, date and place of birth, please see the link beneath this video. This enables you to buy your 12-month forecast and character analysis for 30% off on a special offer. If you order in 2020, I'll give you the rest of that year for free and the whole of 21. If you order, for example, in March 2021, you'll get 12 months from that point through to the end of February 2022. But this is a big year for us Aquarius folk, because Saturn, our co-ruler, and Jupiter, the planet of growth and optimism, come together in a conjunction for the first time since 1405. Wow, that's a big weight, isn't it? And that change at that time stimulated the Cultural Revolution. And we're definitely going to see a revolution taking place over the next few years as these two trigger the process. It began really last year when March the 22nd to August the 2nd saw Saturn go in through Aquarius. Jupiter and Saturn together in Aquarius is a really unique combination because they represent very different energies. Saturn is very steadfast, it's maintaining the status quo, whereas Jupiter is about all that's new, fresh and expansive. But together they kind of moderate each other in a very positive way in the sign of Aquarius. Now, last year they, of course, were co-present in the sign of Capricorn, and that was a much more complicated relationship because Jupiter in Aquarius does well, in Capricorn much less well. It's in full. And around about every 11.8 years, when Jupiter has made its way through Capricorn, we do tend to see a retraction in the financial markets. But I think the two of them coming together is a kind of new dawn, especially around things like renewables. Of course, these things have been coming through for some while, but the old big industries are going to be increasingly challenged now. And this is pushing us to work and live in a different kind of way. So what are the principles of Aquarius energy? Now, when we read sort of tabloid type magazines, often Aquarius people are depicted as being quite zany, unpredictable, very far-sighted sometimes. But what's less known is that Aquarius is also governed by Saturn. So its co-regent is Saturn and its modern higher octave ruler is Uranus. So there's always a kind of a dual energy going on, if you like, between the more progressive energies of Uranus and the more traditional energies of Saturn. And Aquarius people generally, especially those born in the first 10 degrees, do like a degree of continuity. It's a fixed sign, so therefore change doesn't always come easily. But of course Uranus is such a radical influence. It can shake things up in very sudden, quick ways. So the energy of Jupiter and Saturn is really pushing Saturn to be more open to the new and bring in those Aquarius principles of truth, fairness, society, democracy, collectivism, working together on a collegiate basis, but at the same time protecting the rights of the individual, but in a cooperative way. So we retain our soul status as a single person, yet we're encouraged to connect to others for the collective. Now that's a fascinating combination. So when we bring Jupiter, the planet of hope, into the equation, this can be a time of renewed change, but it's not going to be easy because the old world energy that came from Capricorn has been in a big battle with the more emotional energies of Cancer over the last couple of years through the Eclipse series. Now the Eclipse series has changed at the end of last year on the 14th of December. It moved into Sagittarius, which is very good for Aquarius folks because this is all about the future. It's about friendships, it's about networking, it's about travel, it's about adventurism. Sagittarius energy is wonderful for Aquarius people, and of course Jupiter is the sole ruler of Sagittarius. So to have Jupiter right in at the start of this year in the sign of Aquarius is a real breath of fresh air. So it's about finding the balance between our individualism. So for example, through home working with COVID, it may in some ways have some upside, for example, cutting down on travel, therefore carbon emissions, but it also may see people progressively over a period of time more isolated. And we could get this kind of dystopian world where everyone's in their little boxes and we're all connected through the internet, but we don't have physical intimacy because Aquarius energy is more detached potentially, which does come from that Uranus vibe of the need for freedom. So it's not going to be a panacea, this. We're not going to suddenly live in a perfect world. I think it's going to be when Pluto enters Aquarius in 23 for a period of months before returning to Capricorn and coming back in 24 that the big shift is really going to be more obviously manifested. But also some of the things that Aquarius energy is to do with futurism and innovation is seeing things like automation and robotics and artificial intelligence. Now, for example, if we have machines that can see into a person's body and identify disease more quickly than the naked eye or maybe the very experienced eye of a doctor who's been working in their field for a long time, that can definitely bring some breakthroughs. But of course, in so doing, we can have an outcome from all this technology. And that could mean, therefore, that there are less jobs in the old way of doing things. And therefore, the reality is not going to change necessarily in a linear, smooth way. So as long as we're aware of that as we come into this new year, but that lovely eclipse series, which started on the 14th of December, it originated on the 30th of May 1984. It's been reinvigorated, but it was forging an amazing link with Mars in your sector of everyday communications. So communicating with the masses or with people in general becomes a much more outgoing process for Aquarius people from this year, because the last few years, with that big posse of energy in the 12th solar house, it's probably dragged up a lot of very, very heavy stuff. Or there's been a lot of emotional stuff that is to do with the past, or perhaps people have shown themselves to be enemies, unfortunately, in a way that we hadn't necessarily anticipated would happen. And that's been a not particularly pleasant experience for a lot of Aquarius people. So I think that eclipse energy from December has been like a breath of fresh air, it's a gust of wind in the sails. And then we come into the turn of the year. What do we have? What's the solar return? What are the big issues? Well, the midpoint between the sun in the 12th house and the moon in the 7th house of relating is Libra at 21 degrees. And that 21 degrees Libra position for Aquarius people is the 9th house of expansion, of travel, of adventurism. So very much that Jupiterian theme. This is going to be such a better year. I can absolutely guarantee you of that. And then we do have the point between the moon and Saturn, and that is an opposition. So if there's a relationship in our world which is not working very well, it's going to be flagged pretty immediately. But unlike that subterranean, dark, shadowy energy of all the 12th house, this is going to be out in front of you. So it's going to make it easier for you to see who the opposition is and who you've got to take on. It may be that you're going to make some decisions about who you're going to clear out of your world, who's not respecting you, doesn't understand your idealism, your values, your clarity of thought. And if these people are holding you back and inhibiting you, it may be that you need to move on. That's the stark reality of that particular aspect. But we've also got the sun forging an amazing angle to Uranus, your modern ruler, in the 4th house of home. Have you been thinking of moving home or changing your home over the last couple of years? If you have, it wouldn't be one little bit of a surprise. But equally, there may have been comings and goings around the home or the family, sudden changes, which may have been quite discombobulating at times, not necessarily easy. There was actually a big clash from May 18 to November 18 between Mars in Aquarius and Uranus, which may have led to a big falling out around some family members for a lot of early born Aquarius people anyway. But I do feel that the position of Uranus continuing in the sign of Taurus, which is very resistant to change. Of course, Aquarius is a fixed sign too, but it's very resistant in Taurus. Continuity is everything to a Taurus folk. But I feel that some kind of alteration, whether it's working from home, expanding the space at home, adding a bathroom, downsizing, moving, adding to the clan, big changes are coming around home and emotions. That is absolutely a given over the next 4 or 5 years. It's coming for you. However, as we go into this new year, Saturn moves into a right angle with Uranus, which is going to go on through to the end of July. That's quite awkward. So your need to actualize your individual hopes may require some change, which is a bit uncomfortable. I mean, we all know that we can have glorious things happen, but there's always some kind of outcome from the change. You know, you read about people who win loads of money, and then there's all sorts of squabbles amongst their family and friend about who got this and didn't get this. There's always some kind of subsequent outcome from a change. So just be aware, if you're changing something, it may be like pushing against a very solid concrete wall, and it might not move quite as swiftly as we would like. But if we can understand that, it makes us much more patient. There could also be someone who's still keen to be quite ruthlessly honest about the things about me or you that they don't like. And that's coming from Mars's square to Pluto, which is there at the start of the year as well. Or is it going to be that you and I are going to be more honest and direct about some of the people we find difficult, and letting them know that the stuff we've been keeping to ourselves for a long time, we're now articulating it and to the point in quite a powerful way. That dynamic is also possible. With Mars and Pluto in a square, it is important to retain our humanity, which is so key to being a functioning and decent being as much as an Aquarius person. So it's not pushing our weight around for the fun of it, but if there is a need to assert, then that can be helpful, but it has to be used with care, that's for sure. However, that combination between Jupiter and Saturn, which is so exciting, can lead to reforms. And obviously the first house in sun sign astrology is the body, so Jupiter here can strengthen, whereas in the 12th house it wasn't so great. Saturn may limit in some ways, but if you're born right at the start of Aquarius, don't be surprised. You can go and read Sun conjunct Saturn and it will tell you online that you're going to have less energy, it's going to be very limiting, and it's going to be really difficult. But actually it can be a time when all the hard work over the last 7, 14, 21 or 28 years will come to the boil. So some kind of major breakthrough for very early born, first decan Aquarius people is definitely possible at the start of this new year. So enjoy. Now, Mercury is going to be moving into Aquarius in January, but also goes into a retrograde on the 28th, broadly in shadow to the 11th of March. Something that you want to get moving may be a bit stop-start, keep the faith. Remember, that solar eclipse from the 14th of December is giving you such a lot of momentum that if sort of little blockages come up, like Mercury's retrograde, or bigger blockages like Saturn in its square with Uranus, means we just have to slow down and run within the pace that we can sustain over a longer distance. Don't sprint, that's the trick. It's the same for Capricorn because of the co-rulership of both signs of Saturn. So this brings us into this new year. Mars switches into Taurus, and around about the 18th or 19th of January, there could be a bit of an argument. I can only be really honest about this. It may be that you're going to really find it very difficult to contain your frustration if someone is really being unfair. But maybe something does need to be ventilated. And one of the wonderful things about this year for your sign is that all the Mercury retrogrades are in air signs. So this is like the swords in tarot. It's to do with clarity of thought. The swords has got a really bad reputation in tarot, as you know, unfairly so. There can be times when we need to use logic. So even if there are retrogrades, which there clearly is in Mercury, having them in the signs of Aquarius, Gemini and Libra, I think is very much to your advantage. Remember, Mercury is also exalted in the second 10 degrees of Aquarius in the decan, the second decan. So although there is going to be that early frustration, take it in your stride, but I do think there can be a pinch point on the 18th or 19th. Now, Jupiter has got a really strange orbit this year because mid-May it makes its way into the second solar house of your situation. Don't worry, this could bring some loot in your direction. Now, Jupiter traditionally in astrology is about good fortune. Modern astrologers tend to think the harder we work, the luckier we will get. So keep up the application for sure. And it could be that you're going to embark on some new strands with Saturn and Jupiter alongside one another. And Saturn really calls out to you and I to narrow our focus, to really make sure we're not spreading ourselves too thinly, because then we can get quite ragged, especially with Uranus in that right angle, with both at the turn of the year, quite frankly, just about broadly. So important to keep the focus, but just be aware, if we can keep going through the processes accurately, efficiently, add in those futuristic twists, being open-minded to new energy, new information coming in. Jupiter also rules learning as much as travel, international affairs, borders, boundaries. So the potential for you to initiate something new, very strong. And you could get an almost instant return from the middle of May through to the end of July. It's not going to stop coming in. It just may mean you get the first blush. In fact, Jupiter goes into a retrograde from the 20th of June for 4 months, which always slows things down economically. So it might not be quite the big prize, but certainly some kind of new avenue can be quite exciting and interesting. Now, on the 26th of May, we do have a lunation. And this lunation occurs in Sagittarius, but it is in a right angle with Jupiter in the sign of Pisces. But of course, Jupiter co-governs Pisces. And so what I would say here is, therefore, because Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter as well, I think for you, it's like everybody wants a piece of our energy, don't they? And because you can be quite a sociable person as well as a very quiet and reflective person, but the stars generally this year are so much more progressive. Maybe this one is just saying to you, do you need to review? Are there some people in your circle that are taking a bit more energy than they're giving to you? It's an energetic exchange after all. And time management is as important as anything else in these very intense days that we live in, where someone can track us at will, and it's very difficult to create those moments of complete silence and solitude, which most Aquarius people do need occasionally just to recharge. But the role of Jupiter suggests that if you're contemplating anything of a more risk-taking nature, something more speculative, make sure you really do your research, because the position of the moon in Sagittarius and the sun in Gemini and the second solar house means we've got 2nd, 5th, 11th T-square, and that just points towards don't be too reckless with resources, nor spoil anyone you really love too much. They won't necessarily appreciate it. Remind them that their finance is their responsibility. But that does bring us to a wonderful solar eclipse on the 10th of June that's in the sign of Gemini, and this is embracing a retreating, reversing Mercury, and they are both in a square with Neptune. So there is a complexity here, because Neptune in the second house has distorted your sense of self-worth, your attitude to resources, may have made you very kind and generous and altruistic since 2012, but at times maybe a little bit giddy about what to do and finding it harder to apply your natural logic. But I think that can be an issue on this particular solar eclipse as well. But generally, if we just put Neptune to one side and we concentrate on the fact that the solar eclipse is in your 5th solar house, this is about joyfulness. It's about expressing your talents, your flair, your artistry. If you have children, they can bring joy to your life. If you like children, perhaps there's going to be news of an addition to your family in the following 6 months. You can be risk-taking, but just be aware of Neptune's ability to kid us or kid other people into switching the reality around a little bit. But Mercury retrograde also suggests that maybe something that's untapped or unresolved or needs mending can be put right in the following 6 months. I'm not of the school that thinks Mercury retrograde is catastrophic. It's definitely got its glitches and downsides, but it can also be an opportunity. So what is it about your talents that you can tap into that you've not been using as well as you could? Those are what you should be grappling with in the second half of this year. Now, at the end of July, we're getting Jupiter coming back into your sign, and I think maybe that plan that you initiated at the start of the year, the end of last year, may need a bit of fine-tuning to go again. But that's not to say it won't keep edging forwards. But fortunately, the clash between your two rulers is at an end. And therefore, I feel that the last 5 months are going to be much less restricted, and I think you can sort of really start to flow forwards. Now, I'm just going to put my glasses on because my eyes are getting worse. I apologise for that. So from the 17th of September to the 2nd of November, again, we have a Mercury retrograde, this time influencing the sign of Libra, which is all about expansion, travel, documentation, agreements, litigation. If you're involved in anything to do with a deal, proceed carefully. But again, Mercury retrograde can be Mercury opportunity. Now, we also have a lunation on the 19th of November in the sign of Taurus. And if that need to move or change where you live has not been satisfied at this point, you might be grappling with it again. But again, this is a lunation which takes into account Jupiter, but back into the sign of Aquarius. Jupiter and Neptune are just so important this year, just fantastically influential. And so if you are thinking about trying to balance your home, work, life situation, and Jupiter in your sign is giving you some big ideas, some grand ideas, yeah, think how it's going to work, both sides of that equation: home, world, family, ambition. How can we toggle that to get the best outcome? The 4th of December, however, sees another solar eclipse in Sagittarius, the second within 12 months in this sign. And this one squares with Neptune. So once more, a complication about being too idealistic around friendships or money. Listen, what you do with your year is entirely down to you. It's not what I say. It's not what the stars say. I'm giving you the information to make the most informed choices for yourself. But just be conscious that Neptune energy, gorgeous that it can be in terms of spirituality, raising our consciousness, psychic phenomenon, sensitivity to others, kindness, compassion, healing, anything to do with these arenas, Neptune is beautiful. The arts, music. I have Neptune conjunct Jupiter in my first house in Scorpio. So I find it, even for an air sign, sometimes I find it hard to be here because it's quite dreamy. But, you know, that Neptune energy is very, very important this year. But so we must not downplay the value of the Eclipse series having reignited the Soros series that began in 1984 in the sign of Gemini at 30 degrees on the 30th of May that year, which did see, we go back to that original eclipse in this series, it did see a conjunction between Saturn and Mars in the sign of Scorpio. So that kind of energy has been going on, but it's being re-evoked. So for you, it's very much about interacting with others. It can be about love, it can be about children, it can be about performance, it can be about joys, showing off. It can be about talent, but it's all about juggling the time around it as well. And then the swirling mist of Jupiter and Neptune, whilst Jupiter is in the sign of Pisces, can just, you know, create some befuddled and muffled moments. But as you come to the end of this year, if you are single, someone could give you some non-verbal messages that they fancy the absolute proverbial off you, and just watch out for that. And then as the year comes to a final end, Jupiter does switch back into Pisces for the last 3 days. And there can be more great news that brings the curtain down on a year when I feel that Aquarius values are going to gain a lot more currency. In the world at large, there's definitely going to be resistance from those that want to maintain the old Capricornian power structures. And therefore, we could see a lot more public unrest because citizens will vote much more with their feet and their voices to articulate the frustration that was coming through in 20. There's going to be more of that this year, I feel, especially in the first half of the year. But there's also real opportunities for more engaged and collected thinking and dialogue to come through. We've just got to hope that more truth comes through, because there's been such distortion. And I think the Aquarius season that's going to go on for some years to come with the help of Pluto is all about pushing us to a higher truth that's not based on the size of our car, the size of our house, the size of our bank balance. It's the size of the amount of love and awareness and kindness for other humans in our hearts. That's the Aquarius principle. That's the opportunity for you and for me to propagate that message in this year. But for now, I'd like to wish you all the very best. Take care, stay safe, good luck, and goodbye.